I'm not a big fan of the Internal Revenue Service, but I try not to demonize the bureaucrats because politicians actually deserve most of the blame for America's complex, unfair, and corrupt tax system. The IRS generally is in the unenviable position of simply trying to enforce very bad laws. But sometimes the IRS runs amok, and the agency deserves to be held in contempt by the American people. In this Center for Freedom and Prosperity video, we're going to look at a grotesque example of IRS misbehavior. It deals with a seemingly arcane issue, but it has big implications for the U.S. economy, the rule of law, and human rights. I'm Dan Mitchell of the Cato Institute. Our example deals with the regulation proposed by the IRS on January 7. This regulation, if implemented, would force American financial institutions to put foreign tax law above U.S. tax law. I'm not joking. Banks would be required to report to the IRS any interest they pay to foreigners, but not so the U.S. government can collect tax, but in order to let foreign governments tax this U.S. source income. This isn't the first time the IRS tried to pull this stunt. At the very end of the Clinton years, the agency proposed a rule to do the same thing. But the bureaucrats were slapped down because of overwhelming opposition from Capitol Hill, the financial services industry, and public policy experts. There was near unanimous agreement that it would be crazy to drive job-creating capital out of the U.S. economy, and there was also near unanimous agreement that the IRS had no authority to impose a regulation that was completely inconsistent with the laws enacted by Congress. But, like a zombie, this IRS regulation has risen from the grave. I'm not sure what is most upsetting about this proposed rule, but there are 5 serious flaws in the IRS's backdoor scheme to turn American banks into deputy tax collectors for foreign governments. First, the IRS is flouting the law, using regulatory actions to overturn laws enacted through the democratic process. Ever since 1921, and most recently reconfirmed by legislation in 1976 and 1986, Congress specifically has chosen not to tax interest paid to non-resident foreigners. Lawmakers want it to attract capital to the U.S. economy. Yet rogue IRS bureaucrats want to impose a regulation to overturn the outcome of the democratic process. Heck, if they really think they have that sort of power, why don't they do us a favor and unilaterally junk the entire Internal Revenue Code and give us a flat tax? Second, the IRS has failed to perform a cost-benefit analysis as required by Executive Order 12866. Issued by the Clinton administration, this executive order requires that regulations be accompanied by an assessment of the potential costs and benefits of the regulatory action. This is for any regulation that will have an annual effect on the economy of $100 million or more. Yet the IRS blithely asserts that this interest reporting proposal is, quote, not a significant regulatory action, unquote. Amazing. We have trillions of dollars of foreign capital invested in our economy, perhaps $1 trillion of which is deposited in banks, and we know some of this will definitely be withdrawn if the regulation is implemented, but the bureaucrats unilaterally decided the regulation doesn't require a cost-benefit analysis. During a previous incarnation of this regulation, the IRS's failure to comply with the rules led the Office of Advocacy at the Small Business Administration to denounce the tax collection bureaucracy. That office stated there is ample evidence that the impact of the regulation is significant and that a substantial number of small businesses will be impacted. Third, the IRS is imposing a regulation that puts America's economy at risk. Here's a chart based on Commerce Department data showing that foreigners have more than $10 trillion invested in the U.S. economy. And here's another chart from the Treasury Department website showing the funds that foreigners have in American banks and brokerage accounts. We don't know how much money will leave America if this regulation is implemented, but there are many financial centers all around the world, such as London, Hong Kong, Cayman, Singapore, Tokyo, Zurich, Luxembourg, Bermuda, and Panama, that would gladly welcome the additional investment if the IRS makes the American financial services sector less attractive. Fourth, the IRS is destabilizing America's already shaky financial system. 5 years ago, when the banking industry was strong, the IRS regulation would have been bad news. Now, with many banks still weakened by the financial crisis, the regulation could be a death knell. Not only would it drive capital to banks in other nations, it also would impose a heavy regulatory burden. How bad would it be? Commenting on an earlier version of the regulation, which only would have applied to deposits from 15 countries, the chairman of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation warned that, quote, a shift of even a modest portion of these funds out of the U.S. banking system would certainly be termed a significant economic impact, unquote. He also noted that potentially $1 trillion of deposits might be involved. And a study from the Mercatus Center at George Mason University estimated that $87 billion would leave the American economy. And remember, that estimate was based on a regulation that would have applied to just 15 nations, not the entire world. So what happens if more banks fail? I guess the bureaucrats at the IRS would probably just shrug their shoulders, suggest another bailout. Fifth, the IRS is endangering the lives of foreigners who deposit money in America because of persecution, discrimination, abuse, crime, and instability in their home countries. If you're from Mexico, you don't want to put your money in a local bank or declare it to the tax authorities. Corruption is rampant, and that information might be sold to criminal gangs who then kidnap one of your children. If you're from Venezuela, you have the same desire to have your money in the U.S., but perhaps you're more worried about persecution or expropriation by a brutal dictatorship. There are people all over the world who have good reasons to protect their private financial information from governments, yet this regulation would put them and their families at risk. The only silver lining is that these people will probably just move their money to other nations. That's good for them, bad for America. Let's wrap this up. Under current law, America is a safe haven for international investors. This is good news for foreigners, and it's good news for the American economy. That's why it's so outrageous that the IRS, unilaterally and without legal justification, is trying to reverse 90 years of law for no other reason than to help foreign governments. Please share this Center for Freedom and Prosperity video so more people can learn about this reprehensible behavior of the IRS running amok.